Hello and welcome. My name is Heather Gonzago and I'm joined here by my colleague Ann Fitz, and we're here to discuss getting started with web development using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. This session is tailored for those of you who may be new to the ArcGIS API for JavaScript and you're just trying to grasp these underlying fundamentals of what is needed when developing web applications using our API. We've done this session quite a bit in the past, and we've learned quite a few things along the way with respect to presenting this material. Initially, we would just give like a bunch of high-level information without a lot of practical demos showing how a person new to this would actually get started. But over time, we figured it just might be easier to do just what you're probably trying to start off doing, and that is just going in and creating an actual application from scratch. So we take into consideration, what are some of the things that you need to look out for? What are some of the good resources that you're going to go to get the information that you may need? So over the course of the next hour, Ann and myself are going to do just that. We will take an empty application without any code and show you how you can incrementally add functionality to it. We will then include, or first start with a base map, and then we're going to add an operational layer on top of it. And then we're going to go ahead and provide some specific rendering to that layer. Next, we're going to show you how you can add some interactive functionality to the map in the form of a pop-up, and then also show you how you can filter out and display only specific data that fits the needs that you want to show within your application. And then lastly, we're going to show you how you can add additional components called widgets to perform a specific purpose. All right, so before we get started with all of this, we realize that there's a lot of information that needs to be covered. So if you take note of this URL, and we'll also show this to you at the very end as well, this points to my GitHub repo that I have. And basically in this repo, you will see here a listing of all of my Developer Summit presentations. I even have some of them listed for years past as well. In addition to this, we will have our presentations in here and the demos that we show. So, later on down the line, if you would like to just take your time and go through things at your own pace, this is where you can go in and access this. All right, so before we even really get into it, some of you may already be familiar with this, but just in case, we do like to cover it. We do have two separate versions of our API, a 3x version and a 4x version. 3x is still supported, and we still do have lots of people that are working on that, but 4x is the version that we are going to be concentrating on within this specific session. The main thing that you're going to want to remember with most of this content that we're going to be covering is that regardless of the version that you're using, the concepts are going to remain the same. So first things first, where do you actually go and begin? So what we have here is basically just a screen capture of our main landing page for our SDK, the JavaScript Teams SDK. I'm going to go ahead and just click on this. And if you take note, we've got the developers.arcgis.com, just pointing to the JavaScript page. And we have this broken down into separate sections. So we have a section specifically for overview of like guide topics, like tutorials, core concepts, UI specific things. And also if you're migrating, if you are one of those users that have worked in 3 and are moving, we have a specific section there as well. We have a section here specific for sample codes. So if you know you have specific functionality that you need and you're looking for, you want to take a look to see maybe if there's already a small sample written to show you how you can get started. This is a really good place to go in here and find it as well. You can search for samples based on keywords. which is really, really helpful. If you've ever worked with the 3X API or the SDK, you know that we didn't have this for that. So this actually makes things much, much easier. So if I want to search for the search widget, let's say, I can see here that these specific samples are going to go ahead and give me links to that widget. We also have a section here for the API reference. This is going to be where you're going to go in and definitely going to be accessing this quite often. This is where you're going to get the information for all of the classes that you can access within our API, all of the methods, properties, events, and so forth. If you're not sure if something is doable, this is where you're going to want to go in and access to get that information. Okay. And then lastly, we also have blogs and support. For those of you who may already be familiar with working with the GeoNet forum, that's also a really good, useful site as well, where users such as yourself can go in, ask questions, get answers, or help other people out too. I still use it on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of really useful information out there and a lot of really smart and helpful users as well that are willing to help out and are a great resource to take advantage of. Okay, let's see. Which version of the API is actually best? I did mention this a couple times here. So we have the 3X and we have a 4X version. We are focusing on 4X for this session, but you may have questions, which ones is it that you actually want to use? Which one is it should you use? And in this particular case, it really, we're always going to say try to move towards 4 if possible. But mainly that the big thing is just you want to make sure that the functionality you need is provided in the version that you are looking at using. So for example, if you need editing, you cannot do editing in 3X. That is only something that we provide within 4. So that is already, that's an easy one right there. These are just some of the really high level parts of functionality within the API. So if you're taking a look and saying, hey, I need to work with an imagery layer, you can do it on both. If you really need to get down and take a look at the detailed functionality, you can do that as well. And we have all of that broken down here within this matrix. And again, that's underneath the migrating from 3X. Now that 4X has been around for a while, much of what can be done or could be done in 3X is actually available now in 4X. Years and years ago, when 4 was still kind of relatively new, it wasn't quite the case. So it was a little bit more of something that you really had to think about. But now, for the most part, I would say, and what we usually do suggest to people is if you are going between the two and you're just starting and you're not sure, start with 4. That's where everybody should be going at this point. Okay, and with all of that said, I am going to turn things over to Anne so that she can go ahead and we can get some of these demos started.
All right, hi, I'm Anne. I'm also a product engineer on the JavaScript API team. So once you have decided which version of the API you're going to choose, next you're going to go into your developer setup. So you need to determine which IDE is best for you. So some examples of an IDE are like Atom, Sublime, or Visual Studio Code. And it's really important to pick the IDE that you're most comfortable with because it's where you'll be spending most of your development time. I personally use Visual Studio Code because I like the easy integration with GitHub, and I just find that the UI is really user-friendly and easy for me to understand. All right. So the other thing you're going to want to get familiar with is the JS API Resources GitHub repository. This is just a really helpful collection of resources. So if you need to view the TypeScript definition file, if you're looking to do a custom build of the API, you can find the build tools here with Webpack and NPM. You can also find some demos if you're looking to work with frameworks like Angular or Vue. So next we actually have to get the API, and there's a couple different ways to do that. I'm going to pull up the page in our SDK, and so the first way to get the API is through the CDN, which is the Esri hosted version, which we guarantee access to 24/7. So to use the CDN, you just have to reference this script tag in your file, and then in your HTML file, and also this CSS tag to pull in the CSS. So it's really easy to use. Whenever we update the API to the next version, you just have to go in and change the number. So soon we'll be releasing 4.15, so you'll just go in, delete that 4, and put in a 5, and you'll have access to the 4.15 version of the API. The next option is to use NPM for custom builds, and that would be if you're looking to host a smaller version of the API, if you don't need all of the modules, then it's a good idea to do a custom build, but you will have to build that API yourself and host it locally, or host it yourself. And if there's any updates or you decide you want to add new modules, then you will have to rebuild. The last option for getting the API is to just do a download. So this would be a good use case if you might not have access to internet, or if you work in a secure environment. Then you just download, install the API, and any updates that happen though, you will have to re-download and host it yourself. All right. Next, also I mentioned the CSS. So there's a couple different options when it comes to which CSS you might want to use. The main CSS contains the styles for the entire API, so that is always a good way to go. But if you're looking to host something a little smaller in size, you can use Vue CSS. So that is a good choice if you only need basic CSS for your maps and your widgets. Then there's also custom CSS, which you can find more information about that in our styling guide. So if you go into the SDK and click the guide page, under building your UI, there's this styling guide that gives a lot more information on themes and using custom CSS and much more. So that is very useful. All right, so kind of gone over all the background information. Today we're actually going to build an app from scratch. So we're going to get started with that. But the first question is, how will your app be written? So if you've looked at our SDK before or seen any of the sample code, you might have noticed that all of our sample code is in one combined file. So we have the CSS at the top, then we have the JavaScript, and then we have the HTML all in one file. But as your app gets bigger and more complex, it might be good to modularize and split that up into 3 different files. One for your CSS and styling, one for your JavaScript, and one for your HTML and markup. So you can kind of see how we have that done here. It's all split up into different folders, and it's all referenced in the HTML page. And we'll get into that a little bit more once we jump into the demo. But before we start our first demo, we kind of want to talk about the biggest aspect of the JavaScript API is probably going to be your map. So there's 2 different modules that you'll need to include when creating a map, and that's the map and the map view. So the map is where kind of all your data is. It's your map. It contains your base map, it contains any layers, anything like that. And then your view determines how that map is rendered. So kind of picture it like this. Your map is like your backyard, and your view is like a window. So you can look at your map, your backyard, through your downstairs kitchen window, or you can look at your backyard through your upstairs window, and you would have a totally different perspective on what that backyard looks like. So the same thing goes with the map and the map view. It depends how your view is set up, it can determine how you view the map. So there's 2 different types of views. There's a map view and there's a scene view. And a map view is used in 2D if you're trying to view your map in 2D, and a scene view is used for 3D rendering. But this presentation is going to focus primarily on map view, so 2D. All right, so we've reached our first demo. So first I'm going to show you what the code looks like. So as you can see here, we are using the CDN. So there's our script tag pulling in the CDN. And then here we have the the CSS. And then we're also referencing our own version, our own CSS and our own JavaScript. And all we have in our HTML file is this view div. So that's going to be where we put our map view. Okay, now we're in the JavaScript file. So at the top, you see we have this require Esri map view, and then we pass those into a function, map and map view, and we use those to create our map and to create our map view. So this require statement is really important. Whatever module or class you're using, you're going to want to pull that in the require statement, pass in a local variable, and then it's available for use inside of that function. So if you are ever unsure about what you should be requiring, you just go into the API reference here. So here I have the map in the API reference section of the SDK, and at the top of every section in the API reference, it will have this require statement with what you need to pull in and what you should place into the function. Okay, one last thing about this require section. It's really important that these modules are in the same order. So like you see how map is first, and the map is first here, and then map view is here, and map view is here. If you don't have them in the same order, then things could get messed up and your map might not render properly. All right, so here we have map, the new map, and we're putting in a base map, a gray vector base map. And then we have our view, and we're putting in that view div container that we mentioned in the HTML file, and we just pass in the map. So let's see what that looks like. Here is our demo. There you go. You see we have this gray vector base map. It's kind of ugly, kind of zoomed out. It doesn't really tell us much right now. But a trick that I like to use, so I just pull up the console. Oh, sorry for that error message. I don't have a fav icon set up. But yeah, so we made view a global variable, so that means we can access it from the console. So if I type in view, I get returned all of these different properties that are set on the view. So the cool thing is when I update my map by zooming in my map view, the view will also update. So today we're going to focus on a layer in Chicago. So I'm going to zoom in to the city of Chicago, and I'm going to go in and type view.center.latitude. So I can get the latitude of the center of Chicago, and then view.center.longitude. Because who knows latitude and longitude off the top of their head? I don't. And then I'm also going to type view.zoom to get the zoom level. So now that we have all of that, I'm going to go back into my code, and I'm going to, well, I would copy and paste it normally, but I already just commented it out to make it a little easier. So we're going to refresh, and you'll notice that it goes directly into the city of Chicago. So there we go. Now we're getting a little more information from our map instead of that big zoomed out extent. Okay, so a couple things to look out for when creating your first map, or when you're just debugging your app. So as I mentioned earlier, module order makes a very big difference. So let's take a look at what it would look like if we switched it up. So say I pass map into map view, and I switch those two up. So that map is connected to map view, and map view is connected to map. So I'm going to go back to our demo. I'm going to refresh the page, and you can see nothing shows up. Sometimes you'll get an error, sometimes you won't. In this situation, we have no errors, so it's kind of hard to know what's going on. So that's a good first place to check. And the next common gotcha is if you're just missing a module completely. So say I forgot to, well, let's put this back to map, so that's right at least. And then I forget to include the map view module. So let's see what that looks like. So you can see here, uncaught reference error, map view is not defined. So that one is pretty easy to catch. It's like, oh, map view not defined. Let's go back into our code and see, okay, here we have map view, but oh, we're never saying what map view is. So that's an easy common gotcha. The last one is if you're missing your CSS. So it won't be like an in-your-face error, like your map will still show, but these basic widgets. Like you see here how this zoom widget is here, and here it's not. So this left side is missing CSS, and the right side has the CSS. So the zoom and the attribution is there by default, whereas when you're missing the CSS, it'll be missing. And as your app gets more complex and you add more widgets or whatever, the missing CSS will become more of an issue. So those are some good things to look out for when debugging your apps. And now I'm going to pass it on to Heather, who's going to talk about adding a layer to your map and rendering that layer. All right, off to you, Heather.
Great, thank you, Anne. So Anne just went through and she explained the steps that are needed to set up your application and bring in your base map. And all of that's great, but you probably have other types of layers that you want to that are within your organization that you want to overlay on top of that map. This is where adding additional operational layers are going to actually come into play. So in our demo, we're going to focus specifically on a feature layer as a type of our operational layer, but there are a lot of different types of layers in addition to this that you can work with as well. If you go into the SDK, this is actually in the API reference, you'll see here we actually have a section for all of the layers. It basically just lists out the different types that you can add and work with as an operational layer. We're going to focus specifically on the feature layer, but there are different types as well, like vector tile layer, web tile layer, map image layer, and depending upon what you need or what you need to focus on within your web application, that's the type of layer that you're going to want to go in and choose and work with. So again, there are various types of layers that we can work with, but it doesn't really matter the type when adding those layers into your web application. The steps that you use when bringing in these layers are always going to remain the same, no matter the type. So first off, you're always going to need to load the module or require the type of layer it is that you're working with. So in our case, we are working with a feature layer. So here you'll see the require Esri layers feature layer, and then we just pass in the argument for that. So that's going to be the very first thing. Second, we're going to create the layer, meaning we just instantiate a new instance of that layer. So here I've got a feature layer, I'm instantiating a new instance of it. Third, I'm going to set properties. So in this case, at the very basic level, I need to specify a URL pointing to that REST endpoint of this feature layer. So you can do that either within the constructor, or, and I'll show you in just a moment here, you can set it outside of that as well. And then lastly, after you specify the properties, you're going to want to go ahead and add that layer to your map if you're working in 2D, or scene if you're working in 3D. Doesn't really matter, again, the type of layer it is that you're working in. These steps are going to remain the same. The only thing that might change a little bit is the types of properties that you're going to have access to and work with based upon the layer type it is that the functionality that you need within that actual map, or within the map itself. All right, so when we talk about properties, there's a couple ways that you can actually work with them. You can set them individually off of the class, or you can specify the properties as set within the constructor when you instantiate your class. So the second one here, setting within the constructor, I'd probably say it's probably the most efficient way. And if you've ever worked in 3X, you may remember that that was not possible. A lot of the reading and the writing of the properties was handled via get and set property statements. You do not need to do this anymore, which is can be very helpful when writing and reading your code. So what we have here is pretty much the same exact thing. We are creating a new instance of a map. We're setting the base map to the streets base map. We have a new instance of a map view. We are setting the center and the zoom properties. You can do the same exact thing when you are creating these new instances and instantiating these classes and specifying the properties here directly within that constructor. We actually have a guide topic in our SDK that goes over some of the programming patterns. So we have a specific section here that deals specifically with properties. But if you take a look at the SDK and you go under core concepts to the programming patterns, you'll see here we have a section specifically for properties that kind of goes into it a little bit more, talking about how you can get it, how you can set it, and the differences and some of the tricks that kind of make things a little bit easier when working and writing in your code. In addition to getting and setting these properties, you can also watch for when a property changes. So this is actually new for 4X. Prior to anything that you needed to listen to, that was handled via events. I'm getting a little bit ahead. Let me get back to that slide. That was handled via an event, and if that event it wasn't exposed in the API, then there really wasn't a whole lot that you could do. And even though we do still have events provided in 4X, in the 4X API, I should say, we also have the ability to watch for these property changes. So basically, all we have to do is to tell it which property that is that we want to watch, and then do something while it's watching it. So in this case, we're just saying, hey, I want you to watch the load status property off of the layer and do something then within this callback. In addition to that, we also have these watch utils utility methods. You click on that. You'll see here within the API reference, there is a bunch of methods here that you can get to that allow you to watch for specific property changes, updates, and so forth. And then lastly, we also have a pretty good sample that goes in and just at a very high level shows you how to work with some of these utility methods. So, listening for when a layer is added, listening for when the view is completely ready and everything is ready to go within the view and you have access to it, when your layer view is created, and so forth. So there's a bunch of stuff in here. It's a good sample to go in and basically just peruse through and kind of just reference to, kind of maybe get a little bit more familiarized with how some of this stuff works. All right, so with all of that said and done, let's actually take a look at a sample. So Anne showed you how we can go in and just bring in a standard base map. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring in a polygon. So we've got a polygon feature layer showing you some crime tracks within the Chicago metro area. So I'm going to go ahead, click on this. And as you can see here, it's not super exciting, but we are able now to see just this basic feature layer that's added on top of the base map. So if I take a quick look at the code that went into this, you'll see here that we have our feature layer. So first and foremost, the very first step that we need to do is we need to require that feature layer within the application. So I'm requiring Esri layers feature layer, and I'm passing in the argument for it. And then secondly, I'm going to instantiate and create this new instance of this feature layer. So we have the new instance of the feature layer, and then the URL that we're going to pass in for this feature layer. So in this particular case, if I click on this, open this up, and it's going to open it up in the services directory, you can see here this the Chicago crime tracks, and we got a whole bunch of additional information to this feature layer that's stored directly on the service itself. Okay, so let's go back in and all right, so we have the URL to that feature layer. And then lastly, what we're going to do is when the layer is fully, or I'm sorry, when the view is fully ready and loaded, we're going to go in and add this feature layer directly to that, that map. What you guys see down here underneath it commented out is if you want to add additional layers, you can add an array of layers as well to that map. So we actually had a couple others in here. We're not going to show you for this particular example, but if you guys do intend to play around with these, it will be in the demos on my GitHub repo. All right, so I just showed you guys how to create, bring in your feature layer and add it to the map. It really wasn't all that descriptive. So just, you know, we take a look and it was just that kind of that basic blue, nothing to it. Doesn't really tell me a whole lot of what we're actually looking at. So what we probably want to do is we're going to want to go in and give it some sort of a specific renderer so we can differentiate exactly what it is that we're looking at. So when we talk about renders, basically all a render actually is, it's just like it says here, it's defining the set of symbols that we're using for our layer. These renders have rules on how the actual symbols can be used. So there's different types of renders. We've got, you've got unique value renders, we've got classification breaks renderers, heat map render. There's all different types of renders, and it really does depend on the data that you're working with and what it is exactly that you're trying to convey within your map. Let's take a quick look here. And this is a guide topic that I think is very helpful. Christian, one of my colleagues, is the renderer guru, I like to say, and he's written up a bunch of really useful samples and guide topics that talk about some of this stuff. If you take a look under the guide topics, under data visualization, we do have a section here that goes into a lot of this stuff, different things to consider and different things that you can use as resources and tools to kind of help you get started working with this. So remember as well, when working with a feature layer, we had basic coding patterns. The same thing goes for renderers as well. You first off you create your renderer. So, in this case, in this little snippet, we're showing you a unique value render. And then once that renderer is, and all of the properties and everything are set to it, you apply that renderer to the renderer property off of the feature layer, like it does right down here in this case. All right. Did I get too far? I clicked one too far. There we go. Okay. So, so by default, I got a little bit ahead of myself. By default, the rendering information gets stored directly on a feature layer when you create that that service. So in this case, we have this map service that we're referencing. We have a feature layer within it. That renderer is stored directly on that, and the renderer that is on that specific service is this, this blue, just simple polygon. It's just a simple fill symbol. There's not a whole lot to it. If you guys remember, I'm going to show you. Okay. If we take a look at the URL, you should see here we have this drawing info. And this is the drawing info that has that render, this simple the simple fill symbol with that blue color that's stored directly on that render. So that automatically is saved within the feature layer. By creating and specifying a custom render, you can set that on top of what is already saved within the actual service itself. So that's what we're going to do. So when we talk about renders, we have to talk about symbology as well. So the renders that we use are going to work with specific types of symbology. So whether, based upon the data it is that we have. So if it's points or lines or polygons, your renders are going to, be reflective of that. In our particular example, we're going to show you how you can set the symbology for a render using what we call visual variables. So the visual variable, I just went here, and this is within the API reference. There's a lot of really good documentation. Christian did an awesome job going in here and making sure that everything is detailed and explained in pretty good detail, actually. We are going to talk specifically in our demo about color visual variables and size visual variables. So in this little snippet, basically all we have is just a size visual variable. We have a visual variables property off of our renderer, and we are going to apply this size visual variable to that renderer, or to the visual variables property of the render. And then lastly, we just add that render to the feature layer. Okay. So I just kind of threw a bunch of rendering symbology stuff at you. But one thing I really want to touch on here is this thing called autocasting. Autocasting is basically when you don't have to explicitly require your module in your application. So you don't actually have to go in and say require Esri whatever, such and such render, or Esri symbols, such and such type of symbol. Renders make full use of autocasting, which helps out quite a bit as you're writing the code, and you can see that. You will see that in just a moment here when you can see how large it can get after a while. It's really just more of a convenience than anything else. It takes out a lot of unnecessary lines of code that could potentially clutter things. It's not a requirement. You do not have to autocast your properties if you do not want to. You can still, it is still possible, I guess I should say, if you wish to explicitly require each module and then instantiate a new instance and then use that. Some people do prefer to do it that way. Let's see here. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah. Okay. So if you're not sure if something is autocastable, first off, I guess in the guide topics, if you click on, go in the SDK again, and under the guide topics, it's going to be under those programming patterns. We have a section specifically here for autocasting as well. You're going to see a lot of this for the rendering. If we take a look at, just take a look at one of the examples here. We'll go into the simple renderer. And we should notice here that the simple renderer has some properties, and one of the properties is a symbol. Because you set the symbol render, you pass in a symbol to that simple render. You'll notice here that the symbol property off of the simple renderer is auto-castable. That's even a word. And basically all that's telling you as the developer is that you don't explicitly have to require this. So in this particular case, and you'll see this a lot of times within our samples, you'll see something getting used and you're like, wait, you may not see it required at the top at the beginning of the code. That is because it's being auto-casted. And if it is auto-casted within one of our samples, you will see a comment next to it telling you as such. All right, so I'm going to show you how we can set a custom render on top of that feature layer that we just added to that base map. So in this particular case, we still have, it's still the same exact data, the feature layer crime, that crime data, the crime tracks that we had. But in this case, what I'm actually doing is that I am also rendering it based on two separate attributes. So the color that you're noticing here, the darker purple, that is indicating higher concentrations of crimes within these areas. The size is indicating narcotics usage. So I have data within this feature layer that's indicating crime counts and narcotics usage. So if we take a look at the code, first off, I want you to take note is that I am still only using a feature layer, a map view, and a map. There's no renders, there's no symbols being set up here. Everything is being auto-casted. So this is the same exact code that I showed you before, but now I'm adding the renderer information on top of it. So we are setting these visual variables, and just like I mentioned before, that color visual variable is going to show these crime counts per track. Okay, so I have this object that's going to indicate the color visual variable, and then I'm passing in the properties specific for that. Next, I'm going to create another object specific for the size visual variable, and I'm going to pass in the properties for that. Now, if we take a look, we have our field, this narcotics field, and the crime count field. And if we took a look at the feature layer, that remember when I opened it up before in the services directory, it'll show you all of the fields that are within that feature layer as well. These two fields are the ones that I am rendering off of. All right, so we created the two visual variables. Next, we're going to create the renderer. So in this case, we are creating a simple renderer, and we are going to pass in these two visual variables to the visual variables property off of that simple renderer. And then lastly, we have, again, the feature layer. We're passing in the URL, but in this case, we are also specifying the renderer that I just created up here with these visual variables. So now, instead of having just that, that basic blue that doesn't really show me a whole lot, I've got this renderer set up that shows me some really descriptive data that's saying, hey, look, I've got a higher level of narcotics usage here, and the crime happens to be a little bit higher as well. All right, so I just inundated you all with a lot of rendering information. So now I'm going to pass this over to Anne, and she's going to discuss now how you can work with pop-ups in the map.
All right, thanks, Heather. So the next thing that you might want to do is add some interaction to your map. And the easiest way to do that is through using pop-ups. Pop-ups respond to mouse clicks, and they can provide more information on feature attributes of your layer, or location where you're at in the map, or search results, and they're totally customizable. So you can update the pop-up based on what you're getting from your layer, or based on custom text or images or charts, as you can see in this example right here. So there's a couple different ways to set your pop-up. So View has a default instance of pop-up, and so you can set it on the view, or you can set it on the feature layer, and that has an associated pop-up template property. So if you're looking to show attributes from each feature, then I would use the pop-up template and pull that into the feature layer. You can also position the pop-up using dock options. And so those shows the dock options. So yeah, if you want to decide how you can position the pop-up, that's a good way to go. I also wanted to show you the pop-up API reference because there is just so much you can do with pop-up, and I can't explain it all in this session. There are like individual sessions just focused on pop-ups because there is so much you can do with them. So just wanted to show you that. So now we're going to get into the demo. So first I'm going to show you the demo. So you can see we have our layer rendered as Heather did earlier, but let's click on one of these features. So there you go. We see our pop-up. It's docked in the top right corner. We see crime in the tract. We see number of crimes, number of narcotics crimes, and then we get a cool interactive chart. So how do we do that in code? Let's take a look. So here we have our pop-up template, and as you can see up top, we're pulling that in the require statement, passing it into the function, so now we can use it down here. So we're creating a new pop-up template, and we are giving it a title, and this curly braces is referencing a attribute from the feature. So this name is an attribute on the feature based on what we clicked on. And then we set the content. So there's a couple different types of content you can do. You can do fields, which just prints out the fields in a table-like setting. You can do media, and you can do just text, like a string, and you can do attachments. So in this situation, we're keeping it pretty simple. We're just showing you some fields, and we're showing you the media. So we set the field infos, we give it a field name, so that's based on the attribute, so crime count and narcotics count, and then we can give it a custom label. So that's the field section, and then in the media section, we follow this media infos. We decide what type of chart we want to do, so in this case, we're using a column chart, but you can also do a pie chart or a bar chart, or there's some other options too. We give it a title, we give it a caption, and then we set the fields. So that's just in the pop-up template, and then we take this pop-up template and pass it into our feature layer. So that's how all the attributes from the feature layer get tied to the pop-up template. And then on the view, you can see here we have our pop-up property on the view where we're setting dock enabled to true, so we're docking it in the top right corner. And there we have our pop-up. All right, next, Heather's going to talk about filtering your layer, filtering data on your layer. All right.
Thanks, Ian. So now you can see how you can make your map more interactive using pop-ups, but you can also make it more interactive just in the form of how you filter out and display specific data to convey information to your user. So within our API, we have multiple ways of querying and displaying data. But the one that I'm going to focus on here in this particular demo is is using our feature filter. So we have a feature filter class that works off of our feature layer view. The feature layer view has this filter property, which we pass in this feature filter, and that property allows you to specify different types of filters for how you wish to actually have your data displayed. So you can filter your data based on an attribute, maybe only show specific features that fit a certain value, and that's what we're going to do in our particular example. But in addition to that, you can also filter your data based upon geometry or even time extent. The cool thing about when working with the filter is that all of this is handled on the client. So the feature layer view, when we talk about, and the more you work with our API, you will start to notice this. We have these this concept of these layer views. And basically what that allows you is to perform specific functionality directly on the client itself. So it does help a lot of times with performance, specifically with performance. So if we just take a really quick look at the feature layer view, you get that off of the feature layer. And you'll notice here we have this filter property off of that, which takes in this feature filter. And within the feature filter, we have a few different properties as well that we can set. Remember I mentioned before, you can work with geometry or time extent, or even just a simple where statement if you're doing like attributes, which we are in our particular example. So if we take a look at that, you'll notice here that this is the same code that we had from before. So this is our crime track from the Chicago area. But now what I have is I've created this filter that I've set here within this expand widget. So if you click on this expand widget, I have a filter set up so that if I click on I want to see only the tracks that are over 100 incidents, will automatically go in there and just only display those. So forth for 50 through 99 incidents or less than 50. You can see just how quick that was. So we take a look at the actual code that goes on underneath that. And I'm not going to go here and step through every single line. But this is the main part that I want to focus on, is we have this function that we call filter by crime amount. And within this function, all I have is a very basic switch statement that checks for what gets selected within within that expand widget. So if I select this, then I want my where clause for this filter to only select or filter out crime counts of a certain or higher than a certain amount. Same thing goes here for everything between 50 and 99. I only want the data filtered out that falls between 50 and 99. And then the same thing goes for everything under that as well. So you can see here, I mean, this is really the bulk of where this filter comes into play. We do have the layer view that we access off of the feature layer that gets passed into. So again, there's a little bit of length to this one, but it's pretty straightforward when you actually just step through and read through the code. And again, it's all there up on my repo for anybody that might be interested and want to take a look through this at a later time when you want to just go in and take your time with it. Okay. All right, so with all of that, we discussed how you can query and filter out specific data you want to hide within your app. Now Anne is going to go ahead and show you just a few more things that we can do within the API. So here you go, Anne. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Heather. So next we're going to talk about using web maps. So we've kind of already talked about a lot of things today. We've talked about creating your map. We've talked about adding a layer, doing some rendering, adding pop-ups, and filtering your features. But all of that can be done in a much easier way using web maps. And this reduces your coding effort, and all of the customizations with rendering and pop-ups will stay the same. So I don't know how many of you have used ArcGIS Online before, but that's where we'll create our web map. So here I have a web map that's exactly the same as what we've created in code today. We're focused on the city of Chicago. We have pulled in our layer, and we can update the styling, the rendering. We can configure the pop-up. We can filter. So everything that we've already done, you can do in ArcGIS Online in this map viewer. So, there's our pop-up. So we can see number of crimes, number of narcotics crimes, and then the chart. So everything is pretty much the same. So let's take a look at our demo. So I'm going to show you the demo first. We're going to see that it's exactly the same. Everything's the same. We can click on a feature, we get the pop-up, all the same. So now let's look at the code. This is it. 27 lines of code. We're just pulling in Esri web map instead of Esri map. We create our new web map and we cast it from the portal item ID and pull that into our map view. We don't even need this zoom or center because everything based on when you save your web map, then that extent and that zoom gets saved. All right, so here we have it. But any changes that we make in ArcGIS Online, so say I was to zoom in to this area of Chicago, it looks pretty, a lot of crime over here, and then I click save. If I update, if I refresh my web map now, my demo, now we're going to see this zoomed in area, just where how I zoomed in ArcGIS Online. Pretty cool, right? It makes it a lot easier. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about today is widgets. And widgets encapsulate different functionality, so it could be something like Zoom or something like a legend. They're tools to use in your apps that require very little code to implement. So we do all the coding on our side to make it really easy for you. But while these all the widgets have very different functionality, let me show you all the different widgets that we have. So if you look in the API reference, you see this list of widgets. So it could be anything from measuring, coordinate conversion, a histogram. There's a lot of options, and it's really useful to take a look at this to see all the different things that you can easily add into your application. But while there are so many different types of widgets that you can use, there is a similar coding pattern across all widgets. It makes it pretty easy to use. So you just create, just like before, you add your require statement, and then you just say new. In this case, we're adding a legend. You attach it to the view, and then each widget will have some custom properties. So in this case, we're layer info, so we add the layer, and we add a title for the layer. And then all you have to do is use the view UI to add it to the view, to the map view. So now let's just talk about the view UI really quick. So this is a really easy way to position widgets or other HTML, like you can position a div in your map. So this just places something inside of your map view on top of the map. And so you can either use it to add, move, or remove things from the code. So in this case, we're just adding our two widgets, legend and swipe, to the view. So let's take a look at our demo. So in this case, did not mean to click that pop-up. In this case, we are adding the legend widget, which you see in the top right corner, and the swipe widget, which kind of goes in the middle of the screen. And the swipe widget is used to compare layers. So as you can see here, we've added some Chicago homicide data to our map, so we can compare homicide data to areas where high crime rate is. All right, so let's take a look at what this looks like in the code. We're going to go step 7. All right, so here we're just using our web map because it makes the code a little shorter and easier to read. And here we go. We're pulling in our layers from the web map. And then here we are creating the widget. So this is where we're creating the legend widget. So as I mentioned before, you just do new legend. As you can see, we pulled it in up here, Esri widgets legend and Esri widgets swipe, and then put those in our function. So here we're creating new legend, adding it to the view, and then setting our layer infos. So we have the Chicago crime, so we're saying Chicago crime tracks, and homicide data. So as you can see, that is showing up here. And then, so then we had to add it to the UI, the view UI. And so we put that in the top right corner. As you can see, it shows here. And then with the swipe widget, similar pattern, new swipe. We add the view, and then we add some custom properties to the swipe widget. So that's the leading layers, so that determines which layers go on the left side of the widget, and then the trailing layers, which determines which goes on the right side of the widget. And then we can set the position of the widget too, and then we add it to the view, and there we go. Now we can swipe to compare the layers. So that is a little bit about getting started with widgets. There's a lot more to look into, so I really recommend taking a look at the API reference and looking at all the different types of widgets that we offer. They're all pretty simple to implement, and they all provide a different custom tool that you can use in your application. All right, so that kind of reaches the end of our demos today, but I do want to leave you with some more information on where you can get more information. So the biggest recommendation I have is to just get yourself really familiar with our SDK documentation. So my favorite part of the SDK documentation is this API reference. If you ever come across something like in a sample or anything that you don't know what it is, you can just search for it. So say I'm like, oh, I don't really know what the swipe widget is. So you type in swipe, you click on swipe, and you can see here, you see a require statement, you see a little description of what it is and what it does. You can see some more information about the properties and what it looks like. You can see an example of how it's used and some references to samples and whatnot, related classes. So that's really helpful. Also, the sample code is helpful to look into if you're getting started. There's hundreds of samples here, and we add new samples every release. We try to add a new sample for each new functionality. So we try to keep this really up to date and helpful for our users. Also, in the guide page, you can see the release notes. So whenever we add new stuff, it's here in the release notes. And this tutorial section is also really helpful for getting started. It kind of takes you through step by step how to do everything. I mean, not everything, but a lot of different things with the API. There's a lot of tutorials that are very helpful. So that is our biggest recommendation. There's also some Esri-related training and webinars, so keep a lookout for that. We also have JavaScript Online training. I mean, not we personally. We do have some, but there's also a lot of online training out there to get started with JavaScript. Lastly, our user forums are incredibly helpful. We have a really great user community, so I would really recommend taking a look at GeoNet. It's kind of a question and answer forum. So if you ever run into any issues with your app and you you get stuck and you don't know where to go, my first suggestion would be to go to GeoNet and post, or you can look if someone else has already had that question, or you can post a question and there will be plenty of people on there to help you answer it. We also have Stack Exchange, GIS Stack Exchange, where we have some users who post question and answers, and then also the spatial community in Slack. So there is a ton of information. You can reach out to support. We have technical support who's willing to help you with live chat or on the phone or via email. So if you find a bug or you just if you need some guidance with your application, technical support can help you out with that. But yeah, that's all we kind of have for you today. We really hope that you got a lot out of this session, and you can check out some of the other sessions once you kind of get a little more started with the JavaScript API. And hopefully we'll see you at UC this summer or at Dev Summit next year. Thanks.